Man, we got so much to react to. And I'm going to start in Gainesville, Florida. Alabama narrowly gets past the Gators 31-29 in a very good, if not classic, reminder about three different things that are a reality in this sport. Number one, Nick Saban warned you, as we said last week leading up to this game. He warned you for a couple of weeks. His team was not invincible. His team had vulnerability, but no one wanted to hear it. Why? Because you beat a top 20 Miami team convincingly. Well, A, how's that Miami team looking right now? And B, who cares if they did? That's one game. There may be weaknesses you have that team wasn't uniquely equipped to expose that maybe down the road someone can. Well, Florida got a pretty good bite out of Alabama yesterday, but Alabama won, and that's what's most important. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the sport never sits still, which is something we always talk about towards the end of the year on this show as we go into what some would call the offseason. And everyone just assumes you're going to have a carryover and all your returning starters are going to get 15% better. And what you were at the end of last year, you're just going to pick up and keep rolling with at the beginning of next year. And that assumes a falsehood. And that is the rest of the sport's just going to hit pause on themselves. And then they're going to hit play the next year too. And so the sport just carries on as it always was. That's never the case. Even week to week, the sport doesn't sit still. The other team's allowed to try, is what I'm telling you. And they're allowed to adjust. You know, Florida got down 21-3 in this game, and all of a sudden Dan Mullen said, that's not working. That's not option. O-P-T-I. Hey, let's run the option. And they ran the option over and over and over again. And I don't know if Bama was ill-equipped for it. I don't know if they were unprepared for it. I find that hard to believe with this being a Nick Saban coach team, but they had some success. So anyway, that's the second point. And the third point is, these things I'm holding here, if you're listening on the pod, I think you know what that is. It's a piece of paper. Unfortunately, games aren't played on them, and you have to go out there and humans actually have to hit each other, and they have to execute at a high level with noise decibels through the roof and a lot of young guys on the road who have never played there before. And so it doesn't always work out as nice and neat as it does on your local gaming console. Sometimes things don't go according to what that piece of paper says. Thus, the beauty of college football. I know you watched this game yesterday. You've got your thoughts. I will tell you, I had one of the most unique vantage points ever. I got into Beaver Stadium yesterday before they opened the gates. So I take this laptop right here that you're watching, if you're seeing on the YouTube channel, and I just perch myself up in someone's seat, one of 110,000 some odd people in there last night. And I was just watching the games, and I was watching Bama. They're in an empty stadium, and they were up 21-3 when I tuned in. I said, oh, here we go, yawn. And then all of a sudden it started. And here comes Florida. This had strong Clemson 2016 vibes to me for Alabama, because that's about the last time that I remember this feeling. The feeling of they're up, but all of a sudden now here comes a drip, drip, and it becomes a steady flow, and it becomes a flood, and it just doesn't feel like you can stop it. Nick Saban, I think after that game, when they played Clemson in 2016, he said, you know, when we got big guys on the field, once they're gassed, you don't get them back. You don't get him back until next week. Now, a DB, if he's tired, you can go pump some Gatorade into him and pop him back out on the field, and he's good to go 5 minutes later. Big guys, once they're out of gas, their tank's empty. That kind of started to happen yesterday, but see, here's the downside. I guess you can call it downside. When you go back and you look at that 2016 game where Bama ended up losing to Clemson, I think they were on the field like 100 plays. It was right at 100 plays defensively that Alabama had to defend. Florida ran 70 plays yesterday. It was hot. It was muggy. I get all that. But, yeah, Bama, they were a little gassed in the second half. Credit Florida, especially being down early. Normally you would think you have to throw yourself back into a game. Well, that's not exactly the approach that Florida took. Now, they didn't panic. Again, to the credit of Dan Mullen and that team, they didn't panic. But when you get outrushed, nearly 3-to-1 ratio, that's the kind of stuff that can happen. Your big guys can get kind of tired. And I'll tell you this, I'm not going to focus on it a lot. But there were some plays for Alabama at the linebacker position. There were some plays in that secondary. Nick Saban didn't really specifically mention it in his postgame presser, but they watched that film today. There may be some personnel decisions they have to make. A lot of you played football. Some more of you didn't play football. Maybe you didn't play because you didn't like the concept of physicality. You didn't like contact. Well, that's all well and good. That's your prerogative. But if you choose to play the game, especially if they end up giving you a scholarship, you don't get the option of turning down contact. And Alabama had some guys do that yesterday, which is about as blunt as I can put it. So it would not surprise me if you see some rotational decisions made and changed up for Alabama's defense in the coming couple of weeks. So here's what I saw yesterday. Both sides of the Dan Mullen coin ended up landing heads up at one point or another in this game. You had the side where Dan Mullen may have partially checked out last year. That's our biggest fear, and maybe he has not recruited at a level where he can replenish the talent drain that he had to the draft, and that was how you felt. I went to the Swamp 24/7 message board just like a lot of you did when they were down 21-3. I saw what you guys were saying, but then you flipped the coin over. And you got the Dan Mullen as a brilliant tactician, a brilliant X's and O's guy. You just get him in the same ballpark, and on Saturday, he'll out-scheme you. And this roster is ready to go to war for Dan Mullen. No one inside this locker room's given up on him, even if the outside world has. And there that was, too. You had both sides of the Dan Mullen coin on display and ended up being a close loss, and you kind of kick yourself and you say, man, if we wouldn't have gotten down early. But then you also ask, had they not gotten down early, would they have flipped the switch like they did? So it was really interesting to watch. There's positive that you can take away from that, but it's a loss too. You know, it's several years in. This is not a first-year staff. So I've got high expectation for Florida, so I may look at this a little bit different. I know some folks out there wanted to rub them on the cheek and say, good for you. Oh, you're nearly a 2-touchdown underdog, and you nearly won this game. It was a very impressive showing, but Florida lost the game too. And so it all depends on what your perspective is here. And it can be a very good thing, is what I'm saying for Florida. I'm not trying to be negative, although many of you think I am. When you ask, as so many of you did in my inbox, what does this mean for Florida moving forward? You'll find out this week. You don't find out last week. Because really all this comes to is a loss for you in the SEC standings if you don't do anything else with it. But they play Tennessee, do the Florida Gators this week. So if they run it up on Tennessee, if they look like they springboard out of this close loss to Alabama, and then there's a residue and there's a carryover impact, and they all of a sudden look like they're on a different kind of roll, then you'll know what this narrow loss meant for them. But we also know history tells us something else. And that's why this Florida team still has its future to define for itself. What history also tells us is sometimes that close loss, that narrow defeat, is as close as some teams ever get to doing anything special because they let it define them the rest of the way. So if you want to know how to define this Florida team, who was it, Natasha Bedingfield? The rest is still unwritten. Colin, don't you love that song? It's still unwritten for Florida. They still got a lot to prove. But I think they did prove a lot in this game. So I'm kind of riding the fence there. I feel both ways. I will tell you this, though. There's a thing about Florida you need to understand. We've observed this enough to where I feel comfortable saying this. Florida does not get shook at the concept of playing Alabama like some teams do. Now, I know no one out there wants to feel like their favorite team gets mentally rattled at the mere idea of playing Bama. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of your favorite teams get rattled mentally at the mere concept of playing Alabama. I've been on the road with that team. I've watched them come into many a building, and I have watched your teams, how they operate normally, and then how differently, it's subtle, but how differently they operate when Bama comes in. Florida's not like that. It is business as usual. You can feel a different vibe in the air, but they handle their business the way they're supposed to handle their business. Dan Mullen, the dude's never beaten Bama as a head coach. But yet he goes toe-to-toe with them about as well as anyone on average in the sport. He's just not had the roster. That's what it really comes down to with Florida. Yesterday, they get to where they're very close. You know, they need 1 or 2 plays. Alabama's just got better players. You know, if you want to spell out recruiting, that's where recruiting makes the difference. But Florida doesn't get shook at the concept of playing Alabama, and a lot of other programs do. Like, I've watched Bama come into buildings before, and you can see some of the staffers for the other team. You know, they'll start paying attention to Bama warm up. You'll start watching the players on the other team. They will actually adjust their pregame routine because they're noticing Alabama. This stuff happens. Yeah, I know you don't see it on TV because it's before they go live on broadcast. That stuff happens. Florida's not like that. They know who they're playing. They got respect for them, but they don't let it rattle them. And that's why you see them last year in the SEC title game. They ended up playing Bama about as close as anyone did. In fact, as close as anyone did. For all we know, you just saw Alabama get played as close as anyone will play them this year. We don't know how the rest of the season is going to play out. They did not have Richardson at all yesterday, as it turns out. And that's something that a lot of folks, when you were looking at this matchup a couple of weeks down the road, thought was going to be a fundamental puzzle piece to maybe Florida being able to push them. And ended up, Richardson couldn't even play. It was an emergency-only situation, Dan Mullen said post-game. So you wonder if they were to, let's say, face off again in some hypothetical SEC title game, how different does that feel? That's one thing to keep in mind. But I can be critical of Alabama. Now, I know a lot of my Bama buddies have been critical of yesterday, partly because y'all have forgotten how to win. But it's okay to be critical. I mean, you can be critical in a win. For instance, I can look at Bama and I can say, there is not a star receiver on that team right now. There are young guys that have that potential, but they're not there right now. They struggle to stop the run. Let me scratch that. They struggle to stop the option. It's a lot more specific than just they can't stop someone running a football. They didn't adjust when Florida adjusted. And so, that's something that coaching staff's got to look at, because at some point, it could be an execution issue or it could be a schematic issue, and that's above my pay grade. They're figuring that out probably on a grease board somewhere as we speak. But as I said, the most disappointing takeaway for me in regards to Alabama was not that they got pushed. That happens. That's football. When you get everyone's best shot and you go into a place, which I still think people underappreciate, how hard it is to go into those kinds of places. I used to underappreciate it until I got to go and experience all this stuff, and I'm telling you, it's hard. Everything about going on the road in college is hard, and they overcame a lot of stuff yesterday. But the most disappointing aspect for me with Alabama was they had linebackers and they had some defensive backs whose play was not up to the standard that it should be to be on the field for Alabama in a big game. And I got to believe that's going to be addressed. So we'll see about that. But I don't know. I think Bama fans, one of the best things about having Nick Saban as your head coach is you get to enjoy an unprecedented run of success. But one of the worst things is you totally forget how valuable winning is. And I got a lot of buddies blowing up the eye, Josh, last 24 hours, who want to sit there and complain and not understand how hard it is to even do what Bama just did. If Florida put that level of effort into facing any other team in America yesterday, it is my belief the University of Florida would have been 1-0 yesterday. Had they all had to come into the swamp, had they all faced that level of pushback from Florida, I believe everyone else in the country would have gone 0-1 yesterday. Take it the same way you took that win against Ole Miss last year, the same way you took that 14-13 win against Arkansas a few years ago. Take it, be happy with it. And if you still don't really get it and you're of any age, why don't you channel late 80s version of yourself or early 2000s version of yourself and tell yourself, hey, self, we're going to go to Florida. Now, we're going to win, but it's not. It's going to suck. I mean, we don't even know if we're going to be able to repeat as national champs this year. What does yourself from back in the day say? He just slapped you. Your own self just slapped you. Now figure out how that works. So Alabama wins. They move on. Florida, it will all be determined in the future as to the value of what happened yesterday.